Disappointment is something that we all experience. It's impossible to go through life without doing so. It comes for all of us, and yet truly it comes from within us. Disappointment is, I suppose, a self-created thing. The issue of our expectations clashing with reality, creating a vacuum of unmet hope. An entirely personal wound, minor or major. To avoid disappointment comes at the cost of also avoiding the wonderful feeling of having those expectations met. The trade-off of removing that sting of unfulfillment comes at dulling the potential for fulfillment itself, instead substituting it for surprise. For many years after my greatest gaming disappointment, I made sure that I wouldn't be hyped lest it happen again. Generally, I stopped watching trailers, following development, and tried to avoid disappointment. But you can never truly hide from it. Just flatline the sensation by expecting disappointment beforehand. A very bitter, cynical way of engaging in something that you claim to enjoy. This method strips off the extremes of the experience, a self-imposed, authoritarian emotional control scheme. The justification being, if I expect to be disappointed, I never can be. But in reality, doing so removes any sense of hope, a very unsaturated life. Over time, I have been able to leave this behind to some degree or another, which has been to the betterment of my emotional health, but has opened me up to the topic of this essay. Disappointment. I want to talk about two games I played recently that failed to meet my expectations. Two disappointments, one minor, one major. One disappointment gave me a sense of sadness, the other a strong sense of anger and perhaps even resentment. However, I feel like I can't talk about the second without talking about the first. So with that said, let's begin. For a long time, I had always wanted to play Katamari Damacy. It's unlike anything else, in style and gameplay. It always stood out from the crowd with its insane, wacky whimsy. And yet, for 19 years, I never had the opportunity. Or, well, if I did, I never realized it. I had no idea that it even came out in America. It seems I always assumed it was only released in Japan. With the benefit of hindsight, I don't know why I had that assumption, but I don't remember ever seeing the game in person. Back when scouring the shelves at GameStop looking for something new was a viable method for finding games. I found Monster Hunter that way, but never Katamari Damacy. And yet, it was always something I was aware of, a sort of passive what-if game. Something I wanted to see for myself, but it always seemed to be elsewhere. It felt like a rare game, something I knew existed, yet had never actually seen. Until recently, I don't think I had ever met anyone that had even played it either, or if they did, they never mentioned it. It was basically something that only existed in the nebulous space of my mind, the niche websites of the early 2000s, or in the images conjured up by message board posts. And by the time I had my own money, I had pretty much slotted Katamari Damacy away into the if-only shelf in my mind. A half-forgotten wish of a 12-year-old me that only occasionally came up when reminded by chance encounters on the internet. If only I could have played Katamari. I've always wanted to. If only it released in the West. That would be so cool. If only I had known better, perhaps I wouldn't have been so underwhelmed by it all these years later. I couldn't tell you exactly when I came across the game itself, but I would have to imagine it was sometime in 2004 or 2005. Around that time, I would stay up far too late into the early morning hours scouring the internet. I found all sorts of strange, vibrant little websites that exist now only in my memory, and even then only just barely, if even truly at all. Perhaps now more in the feelings that they gave me than in the actual facts of their existence. That feeling of exploration and discovery, hopping from one site to another. It's easy now to look back and imagine myself surfing through the web collecting little memories of all these unusual websites from the pre-SEO and mobile-focused internet, sifting through affiliate pages, a now bygone concept, that linked websites of different topics together. A collection of whimsical, fun, unusual, and unfortunately often highly inappropriate things. Like a Katamari, rolling through the world picking up anything and everything it touches. I couldn't even tell you how I found out about the game. Presumably it was via GameSpot. Around the same time I discovered Mr. Mosquito, another game I always wanted to play, perhaps if only because you could see a lady in the bathtub. How scandalous. Perhaps one reason I wanted to play Katamari Damacy was that I wanted to relive the feeling of that time period again, of which I seem to heavily associate with Katamari Damacy. The perfect encapsulation of the pre-smartphone internet and my perception of what Japan was like. And yet, that seems like a post-mortem ad hoc explanation for my own disappointment in the game. My desire to experience this cosmic escapade predates the nostalgia I now associate with that time. And yet it is partially true. I do feel like Katamari Damacy is a little time capsule, something that takes me back to the simpler days when I still had the dream of going to Japan, when anime was still special and you had to drive halfway across town to even find it on VHS. When the world was still magical in a sense. A strange little cluster of weirdo fun and positivity. And yet upon playing it, I felt the sense of, that's it? Yeah, that's it. It's just kind of whelming. It's not bad, it's not great, it's good. It's unlike anything else, and that makes it worthwhile. It's just that everything else I loved about Katamari Damacy didn't actually require me to play the game itself, funnily enough. But now I have, and I'm glad I did, but also saddened. Such is the case, I guess. Often the idea of the thing is better than the thing itself. Katamari is so weird, and that in and of itself is fun. The novelty carries the entire game, but there's not much to it really. You just kind of roll a ball around. It's not that the game is boring, per se. There's just enough challenge to prevent that. It's just tedious? Sisyphean? I hate to say it because it seems counter to everything about the game, but it's kind of bland. How could anyone ever describe Katamari Damacy as bland? But unfortunately, it is kind of bland. Katamari Damacy is like a perfectly crisp, fresh, and still hot french fry, but with no salt. It's still good, but there's something missing. It's not really what I expected. Like the Katamari itself, the game is more than the sum of its parts. It's a conglomeration of all sorts of charming little pieces all mashed together, and for that, it shines beautiful and unique amongst everything else. But after everything is said and done, it's just a big ball that you roll around. There was no way that after 19 years of waiting, the game could have ever lived up to the expectations that I had built up in my head. But looking back, I'm not even sure what I expected in the first place. It's a game about rolling stuff up into a ball, and I rolled stuff up into a ball. What exactly did I want? Maybe something a little more? I don't know, I certainly got all I could have asked for on the charm front. It's just unfortunately kind of shallow, and that's not necessarily bad, it's just disappointing. A minor disappointment, but a disappointment all the same. Now you might have said to yourself, is Katamari really a classic? No, not really. It's too offbeat to be a true classic. But as I said previously, I spoke on this to ease my way into the second subject of this essay. Because despite being disappointed with Katamari, I still like the game, if not as much as I had hoped. The same cannot be said for its counterpart. But in all honesty, I also spoke of Katamari as a semi-cynical olive branch in a sense, because if a game I have always wanted to play didn't live up to the expectations I set for it, perhaps it will be less abrasive when a game I hadn't waited to play for almost 2 decades didn't live up to the expectations set by everyone else. The second game I found to be profoundly disappointing, a game I went from passively disliking to nearly hating by the end. Despite being a game that many consider to be one of the best games of all time, and is generally spoken of in such high regard that its quality is often considered to be self-evident. And yet, my experience with the game seems completely at odds with what everyone else played. I really didn't like Deus Ex. Truly, by the end, I could confidently say I actively disliked Deus Ex. I had a physical reaction of anger upon finishing the game. I can feel echoes of that anger now just thinking about it. I got mad enough for the feeling to linger for a few days afterwards. I had a nearly hour-long conversation about my playthrough with my girlfriend, and she graciously humored me while I vented about a game she hadn't even heard about until a few weeks before. When I had the impetus to write this after playing the game, I wanted to rant and rave about how I don't understand how anyone likes Deus Ex. Did they all play a different game than me? Because the game that I played and the game that they talk about seem wildly inconsistent. But I don't want to be the guy that writes a scathing 10-page essay on good thing bad. That's not valuable, it's certainly not right, and it's not true. It contributes nothing but consternation. That's just being a toad. And to do so would also ignore the very real part I played in setting myself up for failure while playing Deus Ex. So if you'll bear with me, and humor me a little bit, I want to talk about my experience with Deus Ex, and my issues with it, and how the expectations that I had kept colliding with the reality of the game in such a violent fashion that I left feeling cheated. And perhaps, if you care enough, you could tell me about your experiences with the game and what you thought of it, which I would enjoy hearing as they are presumably counter to mine. I feel like I have to get this off my chest, and I don't want to do it in a douchey way. Hopefully, something good can come of it. Hopefully, by airing my grievances, I can work through my angst. I have a lot of very charged feelings on this topic, so if you're a fan, bear with me. The first and foremost thing that turned me against Deus Ex was that for years, I had always heard that it allowed you to play however you wanted. Almost every person I had seen talk about the game said this. Even Warren Spector, the game's director himself, said this. Unfortunately for me, it seems that any way you want to play does not include how I want it to play. I stubbornly picked the wrong way to play the game that you can famously play your way. I chose to play non-lethally, which requires a reliance on stealth. I wanted to play through without killing anyone, which is impossible. Unfortunately, I didn't know that at the time I started. Once I learned this, I was disappointed but determined to at least give it a shot. My stubbornness would be my undoing. I figured I could just kill the bare minimum and spare the rest. However, Deus Ex had other ideas. A non-lethal playthrough is impossible strictly because the game requires you to kill certain characters in order to progress, but also because actually attempting to non-lethally incapacitate the multitudes of NSF and MJ-12 soldiers is so impractical and difficult it might as well be impossible. Without going into extreme detail, the game's non-lethal arsenal is often unreliable and in some situations useless. The tranq darts take far too long to incapacitate, often leading to alerts, death, or both, as your targets become aware of your location after being struck, and the tear gas and other similar items either do not last long enough or have some level of variance baked in, and the non-lethal melee weapons seem to inexplicably miss and do not always incapacitate in a predictable number of hits. All of this in conjunction makes the non-lethal tool set at best tedious and at worst often frustrating. Which isn't always a bad thing. Often tedium can make overcoming a challenge more satisfying. However, at the outset, I had no idea just how much this playstyle would set me back and ultimately ruin the game for me. Unfortunately, in my experience, the tedium wasn't the worst part of my playthrough. The worst part was that Deus Ex actively goes out of its way to invalidate much of the work that I went through in order to spare my opponents by actively killing them anyway via unforeseen events. The first time I came up against this was when I spent probably close to 2 hours painstakingly going through the first level trying to tranquilize every enemy combatant that I encountered, only to have the POW I freed from their clutches use the gun I gave him to kill all the remaining soldiers. And while it's not technically my fault for their deaths, it left a bitter taste in my mouth to see the unconscious soldiers I spent so long dealing with lying next to dead ones bleeding out onto the grass and pavement. The juxtaposition of those dead soldiers dispatched in moments next to the unconscious ones taken out over the course of literal hours. I had felt that giving Gunther a gun was a bad idea, but I also didn't expect him to use it to mercilessly annihilate literally everyone in his path the instant it entered his hand. It was hard for me to not imagine him executing the unconscious NSF soldiers he walked past as well. The situation was echoed later after spending an inordinate amount of time sparing every NSF soldier I could in Washington, D.C., clearing out the Clinton Castle and subway station without firing a shot, and then again in Hell's Kitchen, only to have several of them blown away into smoking chunks and strewn across a warehouse floor when the generator I turned off exploded without any warning. Again, technically I didn't kill them, but I did essentially set off a bomb in their makeshift headquarters. As far as I can tell, there was no way to prevent this from happening, and the game never even implied this was a potential outcome. If there was a way to avoid this, I didn't find it. After hours of work just getting there and having all that undone, I wasn't willing to invest more time navigating the enemies in the area. I chalked it up to unavoidable collateral damage and was disappointed with the outcome. This theme of pacifistic undermining feels almost intentional when after this mission and the personal defeat it entailed, my companion agent tried to have me reprimanded by our superior officer for not killing any of the enemy combatants. Obviously the game is intentionally trying to set up Gunther and Anna as antagonistic, malicious, and sociopathic killers, but it was a third slap in the face after everything was said and done to watch those people die unnecessarily and then also be confronted by the characters themselves. I probably shouldn't take it personally, but in retrospect, it nags at me. This confrontation between Anna and myself happened a second time when I came into contact with the leader of the NSF. I had orders to kill him, but I wasn't going to do that. I guess I figured I would incapacitate him and bring him into custody, but instead, as I spoke to him, Anna ran into the room with me and began to berate me for not following orders and demanded that I kill him. Despite UNATCO having explicit rules of engagement that disallow the killing of unarmed prisoners. Eventually, the confrontation came to a head when Anna gunned him down in front of me and essentially told me there would be hell to pay for my insubordination. Now, as personally bothersome as this is, I will say it's impressive and notable that the game accounted for such a scenario, even if the actual outcome of the events is entirely unchanged, regardless of my input. In retrospect, though, the framing around this encounter specifically is a perfect encapsulation of my experiences throughout the game. Kill them, it says. No, I respond. They die by my hand or yours, it replies flatly. And I have to wonder, is it the game accounting for non-lethality, or is it just the game using Anna's brutality as a way to push the plot forward? I attempted 5 or 6 times to prevent the NSF leader from dying, but to no avail. I tried to kill Anna many times, but lacked the ability to do so. She's just too powerful. Even a cross glance from me would result in instantaneous death. Once or twice, Anna even remarked that she had killed over 900 people, and I was just another notch on her belt in her deadly competition with Gunther. And it's strange to me that the game clearly sets up these characters as unlikable, cold, inhuman, and unfeeling machines designed only for killing. It even refers to them as mechs. They're more machine than man. But then it later expects you to have no reservations when acting in the same fashion against your foes. Even if the excuse is that your enemies are even more evil and dangerous, Anna and Gunther are individuals. MJ12 is an organization, so it's okay, I guess. But even then, you can't have an organization without the people that make up its ranks. The game even goes out of its way to show that UNATCO is actually corrupt as an institution. I remember the first time I entered the UNATCO headquarters, the agency's seal is presented on the wall. However, before you can see it properly, its reflection is shown on the polished floor. This inverted image shows the seal of an upside-down 5-pointed star and places it central in the player's view. A subtle hint towards the agency's more insidious nature to later be revealed. But despite this, the people that actually work for UNATCO aren't all bad. In fact, the main cast of side characters are basically the only people in the entire game that aren't fundamentally undermined in some capacity. They're characterized as mostly decent, honest people just doing their jobs. Paul, JC's brother, specifically states to you in the first mission that you should go out of your way to incapacitate rather than kill. You are police after all, and he is shown to do the same throughout the game. This is used as foreshadowing towards him actually being a double agent working with the NSF, but it's odd that this charity isn't extended to everyone, especially considering that Paul telling you to go out of your way not to kill terrorists is one of the first real instructions that the game gives you. I guess you're just not supposed to think about it. The seemingly endless MJ12 forces are faceless soldiers, probably grown in a lab, wearing red and black uniforms, and their symbol is the globe encompassed by an ominously monolithic hand. Their leader is an I'm evil and I love it billionaire that was actually too evil, corrupt, and power-hungry even for the Illuminati. It's not subtle. Despite all this, I tried to maintain my non-lethality as far as I could until I eventually had to kill Anna to progress. Not that I mourned her, but afterwards I still tried to maintain my non-lethality outside of situations that demanded killing. I rebranded my playthrough as mostly non-lethal. But I kept getting confronted with situations that were, for all intents and purposes, outside of my abilities to spare my enemies. And while the game does give you the option to incapacitate rather than kill, it seems clear to me that the intent was to instead rely heavily on the lethal arsenal. A dead soldier can't run to the alarm and set it off, but a tranquilized one can, at least before the sedatives set in. It almost feels like commentary. Pacifism, while good-intentioned, is perhaps impossible in the face of overwhelming firepower in the hands of evil people, or something. Even from a pure practicality standpoint, most of the non-lethal options require the player to put themselves at very high risk for no reward, and I suppose you could argue that it is in and of itself its own reward, but this isn't real life, and save scumming an encounter for 45 minutes while trying to get the perfect tear gas grenade placement and trank dart order down becomes very tedious when all it would take is 5 9mm bullets to end the whole thing in less than 10 seconds. As gruesome as it sounds laid out that way. Eventually, I had to kill people again in order to save innocent people from an augmented assassination squad that was sent to kill me and a triad leader in a Hong Kong nightclub. These cybernetic killers had no regard for collateral damage, at least in my head anyway, so I put them down as swiftly and decisively as I could. Mostly non-lethal. But later on, the game requires you to destroy multiple bases filled with people in order to progress. So, if you go out of your way to incapacitate rather than kill, all you've done is left these people to die in their grave rather than being put in it after the fact. Eventually, I just had to give up. For my own sake, I stopped. Deep within the French catacombs, I snapped and began killing every oppositional force I encountered without a second thought. Fitting, I suppose, that in a digital representation of a resting place for the dead, my desire to protect the simulacrums of these imaginary people's lives vanished. More bodies were added to the catacombs that day, and I did not care anymore. I had a similar experience in Fallout 1, actually. However, watching the character I was playing change from someone who only killed other people in self-defense to shooting first and not asking questions actually benefited the gameplay experience for me because it created a character arc for my playthrough that contrasted the start from the finish and felt very in tone with the game. In Deus Ex, however, it was because I couldn't tolerate any more of the game's tedious non-lethal mechanics, so rather than an organic change over time, I was beaten into submission. I spent 23.5 hours playing Deus Ex. My friend, who played entirely lethally from the beginning, spent 12. My playthrough was nearly double his because of how difficult a time I was having. I only played through the game once, and yet I had to replay sections so frequently I practically played through the game 3 times with how often I retread the same territory. 3/4 of the way through Deus Ex, I began engaging with the systems in the way that had become readily apparent was intended by the developers. I finally started playing how the game wanted me to play, instead of how I wanted to play, which was very disappointing and at odds with what I had heard about the game beforehand. I thought to myself, you can beat Dishonored without killing anyone. Surely you can do the same in Deus Ex. Perhaps it was all self-defeating. I had been thinking about killing in games and how uncommon it is to be able to beat a game without killing. Most, or all, of Kojima's games being the prime examples of accounting for full non-lethality, and scant few others. I wanted to attempt that here, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. Playing Deus Ex any way you want, unfortunately, did not include the way that I wanted, and that's really irritating. I think that in any other form of media, something that challenged me so personally might be considered a great achievement, and in many ways it actually is. It's sort of profound how much the game made me struggle to try and play it the way I wanted to, but ultimately the tedium beat me out and left me feeling embittered and callous to it all. And having the game repeatedly undo my non-lethal choices every single time is sort of hilarious in retrospect. It's as if to say, well, you tried your best to save all these guys, but we're gonna blow them up anyway, Lamau. Injury, meet insult. The worst aspect of this is that the game and I worked in conjunction with each other to inflict this. The game by making non-lethality essentially pointless, and me by stubbornly saying, no, I can make this work, again and again and again. My second issue with Deus Ex was that I never felt like anything in the game allowed for creative problem solving, and I acknowledge that this is much more subjective, but there was only one instance where I felt like I had outsmarted the game and achieved an objective on my own terms. In Hong Kong, I needed to infiltrate a secret lab and was confronted with 2 choices: bribe an executive for access, or kill him. Well, I certainly wasn't going to kill him, and I hadn't been stealing money, so I was too strapped for cash to afford the bribe. So while considering what I was going to do, I looked at the underling sitting at his desk asking me to kill his boss and thought to myself, wait, I wonder. So I pushed him aside, hacked into his computer, and then just gave myself access to the lab without engaging in the 2 choices presented to me. Then I knocked him out for good measure. In this one instance, I felt the elated feelings people describe when talking about Deus Ex, and I cannot deny how cool it was, but nothing else ever came anywhere even remotely close to that one specific moment. All of the ways I dealt with roadblocks just felt mundane. Or perhaps a better way to put it, almost nothing in Deus Ex surprised me, and what did was usually negative. For the most part, everything in my playthrough boiled down to unlock the door with a lockpick, with a multi-tool, with a computer, with a bomb, or crawl through the conveniently placed air vents. I can only think of one other time where I said, I wonder if I can do this, and was pleasantly surprised that I could. But the result was lethal and thus undesirable. And sadly, none of the aforementioned solutions are particularly exciting to me, especially when the majority of them are tied directly to consumable items, which adds an unnecessary element of value proposition to each roadblock. It's hard to unlock a door, and you don't know if it will actually be worth the multiple lockpicks required. The game does do a good job of keeping you stocked up, but it wasn't until near the end of the game when I had already stopped caring that I was able to shake the mental math involved with every interaction. Personally, I felt like my entire playthrough could be summarized as constrained. And a lot of that is absolutely my own fault, for sure. Sadly, everything in Deus Ex felt prescribed for me. Few games are able to allow for truly open-ended problem solving, and I didn't feel like Deus Ex was one of them. I found most things to be fairly straightforward. In my experience, and I fully admit I could simply not be aware, fundamental mechanical exploitation isn't possible. Deus Ex isn't quite a stealth game, it's not quite an RPG, and it certainly isn't a traditional shooter, and it lacks any kind of puzzles. Even Warren Spector himself acknowledges these shortcomings. However, he says that being able to play Deus Ex however you want makes up for lacking in direct comparison to its contemporaries in these areas. However, for me, that was not the case, and the individual elements lacking overshadowed everything else present. The game is a mechanical buffet, but nothing in any individual category is particularly remarkable. And this is as much my problem as it is the game's problem, but I must reiterate that I never really found the various methods for resolving any particular situation to be meaningful or very worthwhile outside of the single instance of hacking my way into that secret lab. Perhaps my opinion would have been different were the option of lethality available to me. You might say to yourself, well, you just don't like old games. If you had played it at the time, you would feel differently, I assure you. Maybe. However, I like plenty of old games that I have played for the first time in a modern setting. I played through the entirety of Baldur's Gate for the first time in 2018 and found that game to be incredible. It wasn't until the back third of the game that I truly understood why it is considered an all-time classic, but I had the aha moment. I never had that same moment with Deus Ex. In fact, the game actually undermined itself in this regard in the second level, when a child on the dock not only reveals a secret entrance to you, instead of allowing you to figure it out for yourself, but he also just gives you the code to get in. Obviously, the possibility of finding and opening this passage yourself still exists, but when the game highlights it for you, it removes that moment of discovering it for yourself. Furthermore, I played through Fallout 1 in 2016, and I still think it's one of the best role-playing experiences I've ever had with an RPG, so I don't think age is the problem. I am more willing to accept that I simply played the game wrong, despite that flying in the face of everything that I had heard previously. My third issue with Deus Ex, and the thing that pushed me over the edge from passive dislike to actively angry, was the endings. After struggling to play through the entire game non-lethally and being broken, I was going to put a bullet in Bob Page. I unceremoniously dispatched Gunther and Walter Simons in one hit each, and I was determined to do the same to Page. After everything I was put through, and put myself through, I was going to get something out of this. But, after playing through the least enjoyable level in the game, and being presented with 3 options for how to resolve the Deus Ex story, I thought, no, I'll go about this my way. I should have known better, and in the back of my head I did know, but I was going to try. I figured I'll kill Bob Page, then I'll blow up Area 51 and foil everyone's plans in the process. Win, win, win. Instead, I killed Bob Page, and the game immediately ended. It's predetermined that by killing Page, you side with the infamous Illuminati, something that I had no intention of doing. The ending I was presented with shows JC Denton standing in the same ominous and intimidating place that the game begins, now talking to the new leader of the ancient, faceless secret organization. JC wants to use the near-limitless power and connections of the millennia-old secret society to help people. Morgan Everett then shoots down all of your ambitions, saying they never get directly involved. They merely direct from the shadows. Nothing actually changes for the weak, the hungry, and the people devastated by the man-made plague. At least not anytime soon, anyway. And if that wasn't unsatisfactory enough, the game ends on the Paradise Lost quote, "Better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven." You have got to be kidding me. At the end of all of this, after breaking me down, making me abandon my non-lethal playthrough, turning me from a pacifist to a reluctant killer, and then finally into someone who savors killing their digital enemies, I am denied any real catharsis in killing Bob Page, the most unambiguously cartoonishly evil character in the game. And instead, I am given a metaphorical infernal crown I never wanted. Hardly a consolation prize, an extremely specific and hyper-personalized form of ironic insult. What an incredibly poignant and fitting end to my playthrough of Deus Ex. The game punished me for not killing, and then in the end, when I capitulated, it punished me again for killing. It's practically poetic. Screw that, I'm getting a better ending. I'm blowing up Area 51. That accomplishes everything I wanted to do anyway. What they don't tell you is that blowing up Area 51 also kills JC and will ultimately lead to the deaths of billions of people, because blowing up Area 51 seemingly destroys modern civilization as we know it and brings everyone back to the Stone Age, despite assuring you to the contrary. The implication was that you would remove globalized communication and return society to a smaller, more manageable scale. And yet, in the New Dark Age ending itself, it is said people will return to living in villages. The game seems to frame this as a triumphant return to a freer form of living, but really it's a return to primitive feudalism for the minority that survive at the cost of the majority. And yet functionally it's worse than the previous ending where the elite exploit the masses for their own benefit. Instead, this time, one man decides to cull the majority to start over. Impressive. Very nice. Let's see Helios' ending. The final ending presented to you involves becoming one with an AI named Helios. Formerly 2 separate AIs, Daedalus and Icarus, now merged. One benevolent, the other malevolent. Helios claims to be neither of his former selves, and instead something new, and yet he is clearly more of one than the other. No hint of Daedalus remains. There is no way to trust Helios. In fact, the first thing he does upon being born is to betray the man who created him, instead asking JC to merge with the system rather than Bob Page. All throughout the game, Deus Ex had been presenting ideas of the necessity of an overarching system that could dispassionately evaluate and mete out order over the human populace that was incapable of doing it themselves. Let's ignore the flaw in the idea that an imperfect race could create for themselves a perfect machine idol capable of such a thing. So, you merge with the machine and complete the idiom by which the game is named. You emerge from your union with the ultimate AI as a man-made godlike being supposedly capable of being the perfect ruler. Deus ex machina, God from the machine. The game ends on the Voltaire quote, "If there was no God, it would be necessary to invent him." After an entire game of struggling with the ideas of a corrupt hierarchy, the misuse and distrust of power, and the effect that power can have on average people like you and me in the hands of evil men, after constantly showing that the people in charge are corrupt, self-interested, and compromised, the game presents you with only 3 choices given to you by the very same people the game has taught you to distrust. Join the hierarchy, destroy the hierarchy, usurp the hierarchy. The Neapolitan of distasteful endings. The first guarantees the perpetuation of the status quo, the second guarantees the deaths of billions, and the third has no guarantees whatsoever. After everything, these endings left me feeling cheated, like an interactive gotcha. Deus Ex gives you every reason to, in the end, distrust every single power broker that you engage with and to actively seek to undermine them. And yet, when it matters, you are forced to side with one of them. Again, it feels like some kind of bitter commentary. The ability of self-determination is jealously kept to those atop the hierarchy. You and I are at the whims of those who supposedly know better and have appointed themselves our betters via the money and power they command. All the frustration up to this point was my fault, and despite the game having told me otherwise many times before, I had the hope that in the end Deus Ex would let me play the way I wanted to, but clearly, I wasn't listening. I expected more from Deus Ex than it was capable of giving me. I felt that everything leading up to this pointed towards an ending where these shadowy puppet masters would be removed from their seats of power, and some might claim that merging with Helios achieves that. It's clearly the intent of the game, it's literally foreshadowed on the box, and yet it is in many ways the worst ending of them all. The complete and utter subjugation of man by a system entirely of their own making, a machine god supposedly capable of perfect objectivity. But the game undermines this, perhaps intentionally, when it says that this Deus Ex Machina will be the culmination of all of his choices. That is to say, this new being will try very, very, very hard for as long as it can, until the pendulum swings the other way so swiftly it will mercilessly destroy any and all opposition it faces, and then stop caring. Ultimately, this set me over the edge. Deus Ex and I did everything we could to be at odds with one another, and while it's not the worst game that I've played, and it certainly wasn't the most disappointing game that I've ever played either, I walked away from this experience genuinely mad and confused. Deus Ex and I were simultaneously always in conflict, and yet walking hand in hand in creating the perfect storm of unmet expectations. There was no way that after so many years of hearing other people's praise that Deus Ex could have ever lived up to the game that I had built up in my head. That isn't to blame other people for sharing their excitement, just to say that it was up against insurmountable odds. But unlike with Katamari Damacy, which is a soft form of disappointment, Deus Ex is a very pointed one. I expected to be able to play the way I wanted, and I was denied that at almost every turn. To genuinely hilarious results in some cases. I know what I expected, and I didn't get it, and I was disappointed. That's all there is to it. I can't say that I won't ever play Deus Ex again, but I can't imagine it will be anytime soon. I want to play the follow-up games, Human Revolution and Mankind Divided, so I haven't soured on the franchise completely, but to say I'm trepidatious would be an understatement. I can say one thing, I will probably never forget my playthrough of Deus Ex. So what happens when the best game ever doesn't live up to the hype? Well, aside from a whole host of negative feelings and roughly 7,000 words, not a lot. Ultimately, disappointment is a very personal thing. I am unfortunately isolated from the shared experience of Deus Ex fans, and now seeing a JC Denton meme will be a little sour, at least for the time anyway. I think part of me overstated to myself how controversial disliking something like Deus Ex might be, which I'm sure actually contributed to my disappointment. I'm a gamer, I have to like Deus Ex after all. But I didn't. And many people seem to say it's the greatest game of all time, stated self-evidently and without qualification. But many people also consider the same of Baldur's Gate, or Half-Life, or even Thief. All games from which Deus Ex borrows, and in the end, I probably won't receive a Scarlet D for my opinion, even if it's at odds with the general consensus. At worst, people might say I have bad taste. But after all this, I hope that at the very least I have thoroughly explained myself as to why I was so disappointed, instead of just railing against something that so many people enjoy. I certainly feel better after getting it off my chest. And if you love Deus Ex, hopefully you can understand why I didn't, and relate at least a little to my, in retrospect, rather ironic playthrough. If you're a fan of Deus Ex, thank you for humoring me so graciously. I hope I didn't come off as combative or personally insulting to the game that you like. I don't want to do that. I just wanted to get such a bizarre experience off my chest. I was very excited to play Deus Ex, and clearly it did not live up to the game that I had formed in my mind. If you care to, I would love to hear counterexamples of how you enjoyed the game, the creative solutions that you employed, and the fun stories that you have from it. Thank you for listening.
If you recall our chat in the break room at UNATCO, you know that I have the same augmentation technology as you.
Then this will be a good fight?
With the exception that I have a newer version of the firmware.